Welcome back to Duke Reads. My name is Frank Stasio. I host a radio show called The State of Things here in Durham at WUNC, North Carolina Public Radio, and it's my pleasure tonight to have Blair Sheppard with me, the Dean of Duke's Fuqua School of Business, Chair and Founder of Duke Corporate Education. He has extensive experience working as a researcher, a consultant, and a teacher in the areas of leadership, corporate strategy, negotiation, organizational relationships, and organization design. He's consulted to cover 100 companies and governments, including AGG, BAE, the Canadian government, Deutsche Bank, Eli Lilly and Company, Ernst & Young, GlaxoSmithKline, IBM, Johnson & Johnson, Lafarge, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley. I don't see Lehman Brothers here. Good. Norfolk Southern, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Siemens, Toronto Dominion Bank, the U.S. Postal Service, and they're doing very well, Verizon and Wachovia. His research has been on the same topics with over many topics, over 50 books and articles. Blair earned a BA and MA from the University of Western Ontario, and his PhD in social and organizational psychology is from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Welcome. What a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you.
So the book is A Brief History of the Human Race by Michael Cook, and it is dense, and it's an amazing book, and it really takes you on an imaginative odyssey, and it's well-researched and good. But why did you choose this?
So the question I've been grappling with over the last couple of years is the event that happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So when the wall fell, many people concluded that we were going to converge on a single political economy, right? And essentially what happened is something quite different from that. We converged on a highly interdependent world among economies that are quite different from each other and don't feel like they're converging. If anything, they feel like they're becoming increasingly proud of who they are and what they are. So I was at a conversation with the partner we're building in China who was saying he'd like to understand what it means to be a post-communist Confucian market-predicated business school.
Yeah. Right? And what'd you tell him?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And the point to that question, though, is that he's going to be something different from what we are. Mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. And so a piece of it is, if we're purporting to say Duke as a university and Fuqua as a business school is trying to prepare students for the world we're handing them into, that world is actually pretty differentiated. And so for me, what I've been trying to do is sort of voraciously grab stuff that gives perspective on from whence that difference comes and what we share in common, right? And to me, one of the things is, one of the challenges I've had is I've been reading a lot of stuff about different places in the world, and I just said, isn't there somewhere where someone tries to do it all at once? And it turns out there is, right? I mean, now more or less successfully, but it turns out at least he tries to do it all at once. And I think as a kind of syllabus for understanding the world, it's actually a pretty cool book.
Certainly does raise all of the important questions and allows you a window, a way to approach, to structure your questions at the very least. Understand that, these things are highly interdependent, that change doesn't take place in a vacuum. Yes. There's reasons for all of this stuff. So we're always happy for your questions. Take a look at your screen to see how you can write in and join us in the conversation today about a brief history of the human race. Let's go right to question number one. Could human civilization have evolved differently, and what accidents or other factors were critical to how it evolved?
So, in a sense, the clearest question he asks is that, actually. I mean, there are a bunch of times in the book where he asks different questions, but that one's the clearest one he asks, right? And at least he says, and I find compelling, that climate was pretty critical, right? And that until you actually had an appropriate climate, you couldn't create an agrarian society. Until you created an agrarian society, you actually weren't going to require civilizational rules of any kind, right? I mean, as long as we're meandering around the world, two things will occur. First, you don't need a lot of rules. You need some, but you don't need as many. I mean, the illustration of Australia is an example of what you do need, right? Mm-hmm. And you're likely not going to record them too much, and so there isn't going to be much residual to trace it to, right? And so I think the notion of at a point in which the climate was such that we could actually have an agriculture-based society is one point. Now then the issue becomes could it have been different? And I think what's clear is it was different enough that it could have been, but the forms weren't as dramatically different as you would guess, right? So one of the things that comes out of the book for me is, for all the stuff we talk about how different places in the world are, there's some basic stuff that's actually pretty consistent. So for example, in every instance, it sort of began with commerce, right? And so there's these issues of, are the initiating conditions similar, and why do people make one choice versus another choice, for example? And language is obviously really critical to the evolution in some cases versus not. So I think the answer is sort of.
And he makes that clear point. I mean, climate is important,
Yes.
very much so, but to compare those land masses where there were vast sweeps within a same climatic range, well, then we're going to see people from here likely coming in contact with people over there. These ideas are going to be shared, because the second question after you develop a new technology like, say, farming, will it be sustained? What is it that sustains a good idea? How many good ideas have come and gone and we don't know about them?
Yeah. And innovation diffusion, right? So you come up with a really good idea, how does it get picked up, right? And what was interesting in the book is in several instances he comes to different conclusions, right? So in some cases independently invented, other cases it was clearly diffusion, right? So to me that's one of the issues. This is sort of the stuff that was independently invented but looks similar. It's probably the case that that's going to replicate itself, right? The stuff that diffused, we actually don't know the answer. The issue about why did it sustain is actually pretty interesting, and I think, that to me, there were two things that at least emerged to me in the book. The first is language matters a lot. Because this notion of, if you don't have written language and therefore cumulative learning, your history is only so distant, right? So that there's these images. You have this sort of this very graphic image of a people or a thing in the past that somehow we have a representation of, but they're an other that I'll never know, right? We're in a written language. I actually have a representation of what that other is. So part of it is written language. And I think the second one is actually clearly the case that he's a bit of a functionalist, right? In that if it worked, it stuck, right?
But works over time. I mean, that's the
works over
sustaining
time,
part.
it sticks,
Exactly.
exactly.
But the other thing about written language that struck me is that it not only gives you a sense of identity that goes back beyond a few generations, but it really allows for political stability. I mean, in many ways, and as we know, written language really began as a kind of a way of counting. I mean, it was a way to sustain long-distance commerce. So you've got a very function. I mean, it wasn't meant to forge identity or create identities. It was meant to, make sure I got the right number of squash for my silver on the way back. But what it allows you to do is create a bureaucracy that can ultimately lead to more stable government over time.
Yeah, so go back to your earlier question, because this is related to the what did language do for us, right? One of the interesting issues is, why is it always the case that there's a king, right? I mean, there's a feminist portion to that question. I'll set that aside. There's a really interesting treatment on our treatment of women as leaders later in the book, right? But set aside the gender component of that. Why is it always a single person who's in charge, right? And that was pretty consistent. As soon as you evolved beyond sort of a hunter-gatherer, there was a guy, right? Or the guy, in quotation marks. And that actually part of it was that there was limited access to language, and those are people who they had influence over. So that's the thing about why did that happen. And I don't think he actually gives an answer to that question very well. He raises it, but doesn't answer it. And he does that a lot, actually. And I think why was there always a bureaucracy, right? So it begins in part with someone has to accumulate the resources to then distribute them, right? And in order to do that, you got to be able to count the resources, and you have to be able to make sure that the distribution is done appropriately. And there's this really interesting issue in here about the premise I had as a kid was that kings were all powerful. The thing he makes very clear is that you don't really get too far away from your populace in these earlier eras and remain king, right? And so the issue of language in its first instance of being functional around the appropriate distribution of things and taking care of stuff is actually pretty clear, right? And you know, as a guy who's in a business school, it's kind of nice to know that our literary colleagues actually owe us a debt of gratitude, because if it hadn't been for commerce, they wouldn't have language, right? So
and the rules, so the rules of commerce get laid out, and that means
Yes.
everybody on both sides of this bargain, right, relax. That's good. Well, hey, why don't we extend that to succession, for instance? Let's make a rule about that. And so that means that if you have to go off and fight and defend some far corner of your kingdom, there's a whole bureaucracy there that's much more stable. You don't have to use the sword to protect your throne. I mean, you may. I mean, that's
You
the ultimate.
did,
That's the
obviously,
ultimate
you
source
did.
of power. But there's a stabilizing influence now with these rules that say, "I'm sorry, you can't be in here. Look."
yeah, one of the interesting issues is that that didn't sustain as long, right? So the first rules of law, he spent less time on than I thought he was going to, right? Sort of Hammurabi's Code, and but that didn't sustain very long, right? So I think the thing they didn't get right was secession, to some degree. What they got right was stability of distributional rules, right? And the ways in which we count. They got that right, and as long as a person was in charge. But he also had a really interesting issue, which is that one of the reasons it wasn't stable is that you had people who weren't as advanced but actually could ride horses, right? So this notion of the nomadic people actually being sort of disruptive all the time is a consistent theme here. And he repeatedly talks about someone who actually was a wandering farmer or would come in and disrupt the society. And so you get this image of, we build a nice commercial model, we get the language in place, we get some structure in place, we get actually a hierarchy in place, and then these people who actually know none of that aren't fat and lazy like we are, and they take over, right? And what was intriguing is that they tended to adopt and then modify a little bit, but adopt the civilization that they conquered, except in a couple of cases, right? There were two cases where actually they didn't, right? And his story of Islam is an example of where they chose not to adopt it, right? And so that's also another interesting question, which is what was it about those who were relatively nomadic and conquered who assimilated versus those who forced accommodation?
Right. Well, let's move on to the second question, because we were almost there, and that is monotheism. What was its influence, and was it good or bad?
And this is a dangerous topic today, right? Because there are a whole series of people who would find that question itself actually perturbing. But I think one of the interesting things that you see is there are an awful lot of societies that chose not to be monotheistic, right? And so why did it evolve? And the interesting premise that he spends a fair amount of time on is, in every society, to some degree, there's a preferred God, right? But a preferred God among many. Right. And then a society chose to evolve in a circumstance where you wouldn't expect it, which is they'd actually just been banished and really been beaten up pretty badly, right? Saying, well, we got the only one, right? And there's actually a really interesting intellectual leap from, we have our preferred God who takes care of us, to there is one God, right? And the striking thing about that, if you think of it in Bayesian terms, is if you assume an absolute answer, which is there isn't one or there is only one, you will never change your mind. And therefore, you're kind of an irresistible force, right? But if you permit several, but there's a preferred one, that's actually a fairly accommodative theology. Right. And therefore, you're probably not going to fight too much over the theology. You're going to fight over something else, which is I like your land, or I want to rule you, or your houses are nicer. But there's going to be something else that causes the fight, right? But in the case of a monotheistic view, I'm right, and there actually is no alternative. Now, part of the reason I think that's really, really important today is, for a long time, people didn't bump into each other in a way such that you were forced to grapple with the fact that someone else might have a different view from your own. We now live in a world where that's inescapable, right? And I think there's an interesting question about how do those who are monotheists, and I consider myself one, able to accommodate the fact that there is only one God, but actually there's a huge portion of the population that engage in quite moral behavior and are incredibly civilized in ways that I would consider myself not, and don't happen to believe it. Right? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't enforce aggression is the answer. And I think he's pretty clear in the book that we monotheists are actually a moderately aggressive people because of this very simple difference between our God versus the only one.
Although I do think he made the point in the book that when we were talking about the Hebrew people coming to monotheism, that was a kind of evolution, that even in Hebrew scripture we hear about you shall not worship other gods.
Well, exactly.
There's a suggestion that there are other gods out there, and I think he makes the comparison to marriage. He said you commit to one spouse, but there are other women out there, and I think the Jews did bump. I mean, that was that's why the prophets were speaking so often, because they said, look, you keep adopting these Sumerian gods. You keep worshiping Baal. What's wrong with you? Stop it.
Exactly. I mean, since he does a nice job, although he doesn't spend a lot of time on the Bible, he does a nice job of sort of taking you through the history of the origins and how and it's almost like a linguistic accident. Now, it was an intentional one, I think, but it's a very simple drop of our God to one God, right? And so it's intriguing that if you're a literalist, right, and you go back and say, well, actually, how is it okay in the first few chapters, which we take pretty seriously, that we talk about many, many, many gods, but ours being preferred, right? There's one, and I think it's a really subtle treatment. One of the interesting things in the book is he is pretty subtle in his treatment of many things, that being one. And he takes you back to say, understand it could have gone some other way. Right.
Well, and he leads you to the very excellent question that you asked, which is, so for us, what does that mean? How do we negotiate these very serious differences, and how do we, sort of act with conviction and not with aggression? And by reading this book and in seeing how things evolve, that's the question that, sort of arises in your mind, which is good.
I mean, I think, if you think about this book as a syllabus for how you think about the various ways in which civilization have evolved, I think there are questions that come from it that he chooses not to answer, right? But he raises, and that's one, which is, for those of you who are monotheists, how do you feel about it? And for those of you who aren't, how are you going to deal with it? Because actually they might want to eliminate you, right? and it's not like we haven't known it, but he puts it in a historical perspective in a larger civilizational context is actually pretty interesting.
Talking about the book, A Brief History of the Human Race, and taking your questions, James has one. James says in Chapter 7, Cook says some civilizations use archaism, reaching into their past to reform and survive. What about businesses?
It's a really good point. I mean, I actually like the model. So there's if you look at the literature on change in business, right, there's a whole literature that sort of essentially describes how you generate change in a sense which ignores path dependency. It completely ignores the fact that in most organizations there was a thing that came before you as the leader, right? And a huge and there was a while when I was first teaching 30 years ago when we said the only interesting leader is someone who creates something new, right? And I think the subtle idea in that part of the book is if you're going to create a sustained change, you have to acknowledge that which came before, right? Now, what's interesting in the point that's made in the question is there are ways in which you can go back to origins and actually induce a form of fundamentalism which is your preferred form. That really has nothing to do with the origins, but they're a great excuse, right? So for me, that's slightly different from, at the heart of the advice is your job as a leader of a civilization or an institution that pre-exists is to evolve it, paying deference to its historical roots and what it has that's unique about it now. And if you really want to change, then one of the things you can do is go far enough back that no one can actually refute your interpretation of the fundamental view.
Right.
And the thing about the further back you go in archaism is that you can actually adopt a fairly definitive stance. You can sort of say, this, since these were the founding principles, how dare you disagree?
All right.
Right? And so it permits, and what was also interesting in that point in the book is he referred to people who didn't legitimately acquire power as the ones who would do that most often.
Right. Well, was it a Hittite king who wanted to put his daughter, make her the high priestess,
Yes.
I think, and then he reached back to time immemorial when this allegedly had happened before. The question,
And he wasn't a legitimate king to begin with. I mean, he actually had usurped the throne.
He was usurped.
So it's intriguing that those of us who are least legitimate are the ones who actually seek legitimacy the most by going back to actually unimpeachable roots, right?
Unimpeachable, but then you have to ask, and this is the question it raised for me. I thought it was very interesting because I had never considered this. Why do we take it? What gives that archaism? What gives that historical precedence its authority? Where does that come from? I mean, really, if you think about where we're going, what do we have to achieve and accomplish here? I need to look forward, don't I? I need to assess the lay of the land, and then tell you where we need to go based on what I see now. Why does looking backward have authority?
Well, but I think that actually is related to your first question, your second question, which is, why do things sustain, all right? So things sustain because we codify them in some way as either a set of social interactional rules or law or culture or play, whatever it is. Right. And that causes it to sustain. If you were allowed to deviate all the time, you'd never progress in any significant way. So the irony is, or the paradox is, without conservatism, you can't progress.
Right.
Okay? That a liberal needs conservatives.
Right.
Or you can't really be one, is sort of at the heart of that premise. Or else what you do is you just undo. Okay? So the issue then becomes, how do I respond as an organizational leader? How do I respond to a real change in the environment in a way that is itself sustainable? The answer is, put two thoughts in your mind simultaneously. What is it that's special about who we are now that gives us a real sense of uniqueness and identity? And from whence does that come? Now, let me think about how to adjust that in light of the things that are happening in a really significant way. So take Duke as the example, right? I think that the trip we took last week to China is an effort to say, this world is a radically different place, and we need to somehow modify who we are in some ways to respond to that. But you should never take that trip unless you've thought really, really deeply about what is unique and special about Duke and what is unique and special about education that is immutable and you shouldn't mess up. Or else what you could do is actually just create a really bad university. Right?
Well, let's deviate from the book for a moment, because I don't think we're going to deviate far, but to ask you to explain what it was you were doing, because I think that'll put what you just said in context.
It's actually why I read the book in a way. So the premise is really at the heart of your question, which is, if the job of a university like Duke is to create people who can effectively lead in the world that we're about to hand them, then it's incumbent upon the university to actually create a structure that permits the education that's necessary for that world. I mean, that's sort of at the heart of the liberal education model, right? And all the time you should go back and say, are we structured right, both in a curricular sense and in a physical sense and in a human capital sense, to actually be the place that will help produce the student that the world needs? And I think, in a sense, the two things that have happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall, but you know, it's not a single point in time, but have happened of late, is that we live in a very interdependent world. You can't ignore China and live today. You can't ignore Haiti and live today. You can't ignore whatever it is, right? It's there, and it's part of who you are. And a world which is really quite different in form. So a school that says, we're going to live in Durham, North Carolina, and have all of the experience necessary and all the intellectual underpinning necessary and all of the physical assets necessary to create a kid for that world, I just think is lying to itself. Right? So the school needs to somehow create embeddedness in the places in the world that are significantly shaping the future, but connect those as a single institution.
How would
that's
that
what we're
look?
doing.
How's that shaping up in China, for
Well,
instance?
so in China, you have, we have an option for a 200-acre physical presence in Kunshan, a city just on the border of Shanghai, and probably an opportunity to do something fairly on a much smaller scale right in downtown on the Bund, right, off the river in Shanghai. And to begin with, that's actually a building that looks like 2/3 of what Fuqua was when it was first formed, an executive conference center, a student dorm of 200 dorms, 20 apartments where faculty can live so they can actually access this thing, and then a building which is an incubator, which would be dry lab space, office space with teaching capacity adjacent to it, and wet lab space, so that you have some courses, some programs that are developed just for China that cause us, and some research activity developed just in China that will cause us to be a good citizen of and understand the country. And then a whole series of activity that connects to China from what we do here in Durham and either passes through or relates to it electronically. Right. And then that thing will hopefully be a lab for all the other schools beyond Fuqua to try some stuff so they can figure out what their presence looks like in China.
In the less connected world, in a world 30 years ago, those emerging nations that wanted their kids to have a good education and become the next elite would just send their kids to Duke.
Exactly. And there are two problems with that in today's world, right? The first problem is that we teach the world from a Southeastern American lens. And it turns out that most of the kids who come to Duke will either work for a company that is held somewhere outside the United States, or work for an American firm somewhere other than the United States, or work in a activity which is requires a perspective on things going on. So if you're in a political setting, you better understand how the rest of the world thinks. If you're actually trying to understand literature or arts, you better. And so we're living in a world where looking at the world from an American lens is actually an incomplete education. And so the problem for me that is sort of what motivated reading the book is our kids, our students have to understand the world from a post-communist Confucian lens, if I could use or communist Confucian lens, depending on when you talk about China, and a culture melange, which is India, right? I mean, whatever the lens is, but they've got to be able to interpret it from the way a person would ask the question living in Mumbai, rather than the way you would ask the question about Mumbai living in Durham. Because if you don't do that, you're going to understand the interdependency in too narrow a sense, right? And so that's
So it sounds like it's going to be an education for Duke as well. I mean, these students are going to have an embedded education. I assume they're going to be mostly local students?
No, so think of two models, right? One model is programs delivered for local need,
right,
which will be the minority of what we do, and then programs that actually sort of incorporate Duke in the global sense in activity. So the majority of the activity that should take advantage of or pass through China would be sort of the Duke in a larger sense, not just the local degrees. But there's an important point you raised, which is the goal is for Duke to learn. So the issue is, if our faculty could actually represent the world as the world represents itself with perfect integrity, we wouldn't have this need, maybe, right? There's still a physical need, which is you can't understand China unless you're there, right? You can't. But the objective is that Duke is different, right? Now, to me, if you sort of pose that, that's a fairly dangerous proposition unless you sort of pose the question, what's special about education in the United States that makes it so distinctly good, and what's special about Duke's particular variant of that, right? And so this comes back to, you better remember your past before you shape the future, or you could give up everything that makes you unique.
I want to pursue that with you, but I want to get to Kelly's question. Talking to Blair Sheppard, the Dean of Duke's Fuqua School today. We are talking about Michael Cook's book, A Brief History of the Human Race, and the much broader question of what, in this case, Duke's role is in education in a very, very quickly changing world. Kelly's question, given the restrictions in China, as seen by current events with Google, can a university located there teach without bias?
Well, so I think the first answer is a university located in Durham teaches with bias. So we just don't know it, Right. So an example, I have a board member who said, don't you understand that every other country you go into isn't moral? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, actually, they don't do practice exactly the way we do practice. Now, I think this is not unrelated to our question about, what does it mean to be a monotheist and assert your view on the world, right? And I think that's a pretty difficult beginning stance for the world we now live in, which is all views of what is right in the world that I hold are the only views that matter. Okay. So I don't mean to skirt the question, but I do mean to say the question presumes that we're right. I think that's a pretty interesting presumption. Now, the second piece, though, is I think you have to pose the question, what is integrity of discourse that's required of a university? And how do we guarantee that that happens in the context of the university? Which comes back to the point of, what is it that you must hold dear and you can't give up when you go to China? So that you're willing to permit the question of, but I can't tell the Chinese government how to run itself because it's the Chinese government, it's not my own.
Right. I mean, I think there's a fundamental difference between every other country in the world isn't moral and what do you do about integrity of research when the Chinese government is going to cut off avenues of real intellectual input or inquiry?
So I think the answer is two parts. First is we're there to understand it. And the second part is, because actually that's part of what it means to know the world, right? And so if you choose not to go, you'll never understand it. And the second part is that if we're going to bring the world together on better terms, civil society is going to have to be in the middle of it. So the issue is China, if there are things that China does that we consider wrong, is it more likely to change if we're there or we're not? Right. Now that gets back to the agreement you have to have with your host is there are certain things we're going to do because it's a requirement of us being an effective university. And if you actually want a North American university to come, it's kind of a requisite, right? And do that in a way that is not so rigid that you'll never learn, right? And that's the trick, right? So it's not unlike this issue of how do you keep the past and accommodate to the present? How do you keep what is a critical sense of integrity but accommodate to what's unique in Chinese market? And the interesting issue is we put that question in a very dramatic way and said, we're going to teach what we teach, we're going to say what we say, and our students are going to do what they do. You can't edit, fine, right?
Right.
Don't cause a revolution in our country, right? Reasonable request.
I have had that experience, if I can digress for a moment, teaching journalism abroad, and I was in Kosovo, and a station manager there, a Kosovar had just taken control, didn't really understand completely the idea of balance and sort of getting the other side. I mean, he had been listening to one side all of his life. It was Serbs, and they'd killed his family. So honestly, the other side to him was a bunch of liars. Why would I allow that side on the air? And he forbade it. Now, I'm, come from a tradition where you must have this. He won the argument. It's his radio station. But I pressed it. I'll say that I pressed it, and by the end of my stay, was able to sort of make an example. I won't get into the whole story, but I was able to make an example, and he was much more thoughtful about that by the time I left. And it was an argument and a series of questions that I don't think he would have considered had I not been there, and lost the battle.
So let's use that metaphor to come back to the Google example. What's interesting in that is actually the Chinese haven't said to us, and they haven't said to any university hiring in China, you can't tell the other side of the story. They haven't said that, right? What they have said to Google, and they wouldn't say to us on a private Duke network, but they would publicly, because as soon as it's public, they control the internet in China, is there are certain points of discourse we don't like very much, right? But within our own walls, we can do whatever we want to do. What's interesting is when you talk to the kids in China, they're really terrified that Google might leave because actually there's some really interesting stuff that goes on in Google that doesn't go in other places. Now, I think that's true for us too. It turns out in the end, Google decided to stay. Right? And you can have a fairly cynical view of that,
Yeah.
or you can actually have a view which I think is closer to the truth, which is they actually got ahead of themselves when they made the announcement. They hadn't thought through it enough. And then when they thought through it, they really said, actually, we're better progressing forward every day and getting a little more open, a little more open, a little more open, because it turns out historically it has been. Now, there are some ways in which China's gotten more closed in the last year. But Google's made real progress, and the kids want them there. Now, I think that's true for us too. If we're there on our terms, we're more likely to affect the sort of free discourse than if we're not.
Blair Sheppard is with me, the Dean of Duke's Fuqua School, talking about a brief history of the human race. And let's get back to question number 3. Is human civilization more or less differentiated today than at earlier periods? And that's another.
So it's an interesting question. So before we went on, you sort of posed this interesting thing, which is he raises the point that why is it that he would assert that that language would be more differentiated in northern China where it began than in southern China to where it migrated, right? I mean, the written form of Chinese language, right, is the thing. And for many people that's counterintuitive, right?
It was for me.
That actually with more time you get more differentiated, okay?
Well, I assume that with distance, that the farther you travel.
It's actually a temporal issue, right? So that with more time you get more differentiated because there's more opportunities to actually have local need and local variation. And if there's one person comes and they speak the language, then you just do that. And then over time we adapt because I live in a mountain, I live in a valley, and so I accommodate my language. So the theory would be, if you follow that notion of temporality as the only issue, that we would be more and more differentiated, right? He kind of argues that there was a particular point where we were probably most differentiated. And it's an interesting one because it relates to sort of a very current question, right? And it goes as follows. Is globalization homogenizing or not? Okay. And a piece of the reason for being interested in this book to me is, in a sense, you could frame it the following way. I made a very strong assertion that we are highly interdependent and very differentiated. There's a very compelling alternative view, which is we are highly interdependent and decreasingly differentiated every day. And I think in some ways that question frames a point of view, which is if we are less and less differentiated now than we were 10,000 years ago, right, or 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, then you could argue we're going to converge, right, or at least we'll be more similar tomorrow than we are today. If we are about the same, then you can argue there's an interesting balance point. And if we're more differentiated, then you can argue actually we're not going to converge. We're just going to get, we're going to have this issue of we share things in common like a technology platform we interact with each other over, but we're actually going to retain what's different. And I think, where I get, not from his book, but in reflecting on the book, is there are ways in which we will be more similar, and there are ways in which we will try to preserve our difference, which is actually a point he makes in one of his chapters. That as I start to accommodate to another civilization, I just won't give something up, right?
Well, and that, getting back to the Duke question, and going abroad, there's one issue about what's your impact on China?
Yes.
So you can imagine that. Well, then what happens here? I mean, Duke is, after all, this chapel, the place. It is a location. Exactly. It is Shashevskyville. It's the team. Well, you don't have that in Shanghai. And so what does that do to your identity as you open your mind and become more broad-minded about the way things work? So
for what it's worth, basketball, we won't give up because the Chinese have this emergent passion with basketball, right?
There you go.
And so I wouldn't worry about that.
And it may help recruiting, is what you're saying?
Well, I actually, one of the ideas we had was that if we really wanted to build our brand in China, what we should do is have Coach K find a big man or a starting guard from China and recruit him and come and play a few games, right? But I think your point's really critical, which is, as you do anything, and this is true for a student, right? So if a student leaves Duke, or a student is part of Duke and actually goes to a different place, how do you not lose your soul, right? And I think that, the reason I've stayed at Duke for 30 years is something very special about this place. And so as you do, as we migrate to places other than Durham and we engage a very compelling social psychology which is not our own, how do you not lose what matters the most? Right? Now it goes back to sort of a point we talked about maybe 10 minutes ago, which is if you're going to change, remember your core, right? Don't lose it. Now the problem is one of the problems is you don't know what's special about you until it gets put in play, right? And there I think what you have to do is just be incredibly sensitive to the cues that come up that say, this one went too far, guys, let's do something different, right? And I hope we do. It's a funny thing though, you don't really know who you are until you start engaging other people, because it's their response to you that teaches you who you are. And I think there's a danger that the university can get complacent about who it is, and doing something like go to China actually will force us to get a little clearer about those things we really, really care about, and those things that are just kind of surface features of the place.
Right, so instead of being afraid of losing your soul, you may actually discover your soul.
At least know it better.
Know it better.
Yeah.
Yeah. We are talking today, we're going to take your questions, take a look at the screen to figure out how to get your questions to us as we continue to talk about the brief history of the human race with Blair Sheppard, Dean of Fuqua's Business School. We can move on to the fourth question, which is, does civilization easily change?
So, I think he's not very clear on the answer to that question, but I do believe a couple of things. So this interesting story, one of the things that I found striking, for example, is that I always thought of Genghis Khan as a huge influence in the world, right? Because he essentially was the first conqueror or invader that actually integrated radically different societies and created the spice trade and all the things that happened over top of the mountains coming back down, and actually caused the Mongols to create the Mughals in India, who ran the country for 500 years and actually defined the boundaries of China. So I had this whole notion that if there was any one event in the history of the world that actually had the most effect on the world, it was Genghis Khan. He just wrote him off, right? And the reason he wrote him off is he said he was entirely assimilative, that essentially because he had no huge culture of his own, he sort of adopted the others. And so the Western portion of that society was actually largely Islamic and adopted models, and the Eastern portion was largely Chinese and adopted. And actually, part of the reason it dissolved, I think, is it actually became this multiplex of civilizations that was held in common sort of largely out of fear of the great Khan. And so one of the things you do know is that an outside intervention will get more often than not assimilated, right? So then the question becomes, what are the sorts of intervention that will cause a civilization to change? And there's a couple of things. One of them is that that civilizations will change because they fail, right? So there's a bunch of stories in here of things just falling apart, and so they dissolve, which is not the sort of change you'd want to have. You know that there are some civilizations that accommodated to new structures. And so the whole notion of climate got more hospitable, therefore we evolved civilization, is the prima facie case that civilizations will change in response to some things, right? And then that certain outside influences, but what the influences had was a belief that they were right and the other was wrong, and they imposed that belief on the other.
But both of these questions, I think, raise an even larger question, and that is, what do you mean by change? I mean, that's because initially in the most primitive and simple societies, yeah, climate's going to dictate change. It's probably going to dictate technology and innovation. If you come up with a way to plant a seed, you're the winner. If you can't figure it out, you're... But as societies become more complex and develop political systems and become multicultural, the question gets back to this question of, are you finding your soul or losing it? What is essential to us? What does it mean essentially to be Turkish?
What does change mean?
What does change mean?
So there's a piece that comes up in that, which is a long-standing construct in sociology about institutionalization, and it goes as follows: that we create structures to support a particular need. And then over time, we institutionalize those structures into a kind of hierarchical bureaucratic model, right? and that what evolves is the sustainment of the bureaucracy becomes the end rather than the means. And oftentimes you find yourself in a circumstance where you have this paradoxical thing, which is to the perpetuation of bureaucracy, you actually do something which is completely antithetical to the original region.
Because the need has changed.
Yeah, so it'd be something like Duke actually doing a bad job of education because of a system we have in place. So I could probably give a couple of examples, but not on air.
Not here.
But that's the example. You know, the thing that sort of struck me, that illustrated that to me, was actually sort of the terrible of things that the church did at the start of the just before the Renaissance. It actually in some ways caused the Renaissance. And you could see circumstances where we did things that were completely against the original teachings that to perpetuate the bureaucracy. Right? And it happens again and again and again. So the question of what is you changing is a really interesting issue. So, but here I think he is a functionalist, which is civilization evolves to actually meet a need that civilization has to manage the commercial and interactional requirements of the society that exists. And that I think he would argue that you should retain those things that are functional and you should drop those things that aren't. So there's this interesting piece that isn't in the book but comes from the book that gets suggested by the book, which is we have on our faculty a guy who asks a really, really interesting question about, which is why is it that the kinds of constructs around commerce and transfer of wealth across generations and enterprise that made Islam such a fantastic religion for the sustainment of the silk trade actually made it hard to adopt modernity, right? And that's a case of, and so the question is, in that case, what must you retain and what must you adapt to be really effective? And what's interesting is it's actually the question I hear every time I go to the Middle East, right? The Arab-influenced Middle East.
Right.
And they sort of pose the issue, we're a little irritated that you guys are ahead of us, right? We don't want to adopt all the things you believe because if we do, we lose our tradition. So what does it mean to have a uniquely Arab-Islamic economy? What was striking to me about that is actually it's a very self-reflective question, and it's actually a very, very critical question. When you have a thoughtful discussion with the people we meet in UAE, for example, where we are, they're very reflective about the question.
Right.
And in that, they're asking the question you asked really at the heart of it, which is, what do we have to keep, and what must we change so that we don't lose our soul?
Well, let's go back to that because there's an interesting change that took place in Europe that I think allowed for, say, colonialism, and that would be, I mean, to put it simply, if the joint stock company is a change in the way we assemble capital.
Yeah.
And there's a fundamental, I mean, it may be oversimplifying, but there may have been a fundamental religious change, a change in the sect in Christianity that allowed for the ostentatious, a show of wealth. Now, if that's, maybe an old model, maybe it's not true, but something happened, and we took that surplus that was what allowed civilization to flourish, right? We had a little extra food at the end of the week, and now we convert that to money, and we allow the risk not to the soldier but to the investor, and that allows colonialism, which looked different than what happens in the Balkans with the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think, first of all, what permitted colonialism was actually ocean navigation, right? If you didn't have that, you wouldn't have had it in the first place.
Yeah, but couldn't the Muslims have done that from the Balkans?
Yeah, they actually did, but they didn't navigate the ocean, which is interesting. One of the interesting questions was, you had the Oman was an empire, right? At the same time, Portugal was. But it couldn't build this extended empire, I think for the reasons you're describing. But a lot of it was Portugal got to North America. So this is one of the cases of what would have been different. So 1421, Chinese had a huge navy, right? There's an argument they circumnavigated the world. And there's actually some evidence they did. But when the admiral came back, he unfortunately came back to a China that had decided to close its walls because the city had burned down, right? The Beijing, they just built this beautiful forbidden city, and a lot of it had burned. and they said there's a message here that we never should have left, and therefore they closed in. And China for several hundred years closed in on itself after that and stopped being. But you know, what would the world look like if they'd actually sustained the naval power, and their boats were better, they were more stable, they had they had these chambers that were separated from each other, so if you actually got hit, it didn't flood the whole boat. They had all the stuff we now do. They had tremendous technology,
Certainly
but it didn't
had the
happen.
wealth, right, to support the risk.
And so would they have had a colonial model that was Confucian versus a colonial model which was actually corporate enterprise in a way that we evolved it, right? So first thing is, I think there's an interesting accidental question there. But now to your point, there's an argument that the most important commercial invention in the Anglo-American model, or at least the Judeo-Christian model as we now practice it, right, was a limited liability corporation. Because it did a whole bunch of things. First of all, it actually took wealth which was captive in families and made it a public wealth, which allowed accumulation of much, much, much greater wealth. And it also permitted limited liability, so that you were willing to do things that you never would have done if someone could go after everything you owned. So all you had to do was give me a quarter of your wealth, and that's what you put in play. You didn't put everything in play. So when someone says, we're going to go try this crazy thing and go to the Americas, because my entire wealth is not at risk, I'm more willing to fund it. Right? Now that permitted scale, that permitted globalization, that permitted the development of evolution of technology, and I think you're right to say it permitted colonialization. It may be the most important commercial invention of all time. That or rule of law.
And it brings us, I think, to our last question: where to now, given this the post-communist Confucian society that's having to embrace these principles that didn't seem to, particularly not economic principles, financial principles that evolved.
Rules of trade.
Rules of
I mean,
trade.
so one of the arguments is, if I go back to the point about sort of some of the Islamic tradition, one of the dilemmas is it's really hard to set up a limited liability corporation when actually you have to distribute all your assets after you die. Right. There's just things that are hard.
Yeah.
Right? So if you begin with a premise that says we're now in a world that will have complex economic exchanges of a scope and scale we haven't seen, right? And a pretty good bet that we don't know how to deal with it, as evidenced by the crisis of the last 2 years. I think it's really incumbent upon us to pose the question, what does modernity version 2 look like? Right? I'm not asking a postmodern question. I'll leave that to other colleagues. But I am asking a question that says, you're now going to be engaged with a series of people whose civilizational assumptions are not your own. But you're actually going to create huge economic interdependence. Now let's go back to the first point we made, I think, which is the first uses of language were commercial. So if civilization has some of its roots, the preservation of commercial practices that allow a set of people to engage each other in complex ways, and we have a lot of civilizations that are dramatically different in their assumptions about what those practices should be, and we're going to work with each other internationally, that's the $64,000 question. And it now comes back to, why are we in China, right? I mean, if you said, Blair, what's the answer to that question? I have no idea, actually. I really don't. I have some hypotheses. But if you said, do you know what that's going to look like? My answer is no, and no one does, right? I mean, no one really does. And we don't know. So I'll give one interesting issue. A bunch of people outside the United States chose to invest in really stupid products because they believed that we knew what we were doing, right? And that actually things like Citi were iconic representations of the trust you could have in the American economic system. Okay. What then happened is, as soon as they got beaten badly in that product, they concluded the entire system was broken. Now, I don't think there were many CEOs of large banks who actually put the following question to themselves. If I sell a product in China that's being bought because they trust my brand, if that product fails on a large scale, are they going to lose faith in the entire global economy? I don't think they asked that question. The reason they didn't ask that question is we actually didn't know how to frame that question before, right? It's a variant of a million questions we should be asking, which is, what does it mean to actually have a legal system that incorporates sort of a Chinese bureaucratic model and an American market economy, right? What does it mean to have transactions of that kind? And what we're finding is it's really hard, right? So what does it mean to be a university in China that's actually, as the questioner asked, tries to engage in education the way we think is appropriate? Without it, it's tough. So I don't know.
So engagement is really the answer.
I think so. Engagement, reflection, and so we need, this goes back to the key point. This is not about just doing something for our students. This is about doing something for ourselves.
Blair, what a pleasure.
Thank you.
Blair Sheppard is part of Duke Reads today, the Dean of Duke's Fuqua School, and we're going to be letting you know shortly when we, during the month of March, we're going to reschedule our session with Reynolds Price, discussion of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Our next scheduled session is on March 17th. Michael Malone's going to be here to discuss The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett, and we will welcome, of course, your questions in advance, and we're going to let you know when we'll do To the Lighthouse with Reynolds Price. That will be sometime in March. And I want to remind you that this Friday, January 29th, you can tune in to Ustream for office hours. At noon Eastern Time, Professor Nagar Motaheda will be here. She's going to talk about the topic of representing Iran. Thank you very much and good night.